Chapter 6. Medieval Economic Teaching. Division of the subject. Christian principles dominated the economic no less than the political teaching in medieval times. The responsibilities attaching to the ownership of property, the principles of justice and equity in wages and commercial dealings, the lawfulness or unlawfulness of charging interest upon borrowed money, are questions of conscience which find practical application every day of one's life. Hence it was inevitable that the Church's teaching upon such matters should exert a profound influence on social relations among Catholic and deeply religious communities, as all the European nations then were. We shall, therefore, treat briefly of the three main principles of medieval economy that clash most strongly with modern liberal views. These relate to ownership of goods, the just price in buying and selling, and usury. The contrast between social and economic life, as we know it today, and that of the Christian period is rooted mainly upon the difference between the Christian and the modern liberal attitude towards those three opinions. Article 1. Ownership of goods. Before attempting to analyze the medieval doctrine of ownership, which has always been the Catholic view, we shall first try to explain briefly the difference between private ownership and the communal ownership of goods. Communal ownership. In communal ownership, the goods in question are held in common by the members of a certain group, such as a corporation, a municipality, an industrial guild, or even the state itself. No individual member can claim exclusive ownership of any of the goods, although he may use them in common with the other members as far as his needs require, or even may have certain portions of them, determined according to the nature and extent of his needs, assigned to him for his exclusive use. Religious communities and Socialists. This type of ownership is familiar to us in the institution of religious communities. The community or congregation owns property as a corporate body, but the individual members are excluded by their vow of religious poverty from personal or private ownership, or at least from the free exercise of it. Each member does the work assigned him, and each receives from the common store all he may reasonably require. Such also is the system of ownership which the Socialists, or certain sections of them, aim at establishing, at least to some extent over the whole state. They would have the goods, or at least the productive goods, owned in common by certain groups within the state, or even by the whole state as one corporate body, while the individual members cooperate in the work of production and distribution, and each is enabled to use the property and to enjoy the fruits of the cooperative labor in accordance with his reasonable needs. Communal ownership and co-partnership. We may note that communal ownership, as here defined, differs essentially from co-partnership as exemplified in trading companies. In the latter system, the extent of each member's claim upon the fruits of the industry is determined solely by the amount he has contributed by the common fund, whether in capital or by labor, while, in communal ownership, the individual member's claim is determined principally or solely by his reasonable needs. Communism and collectivism. We may further note the distinction sometimes made between communism and collectivism. Both these terms imply common ownership of the means of production, established as a regular system over the whole state. In the system known as communism, which is characterized by communal ownership properly so called, the distribution of the produce is made according to the principle, to each according to his needs, whereas in the system known as collectivism, the distribution of the produce is carried out on the principle, to each one according to his merits. In other words, under the collectivist system, each is supposed to receive his share of the fruits of the work of production in proportion to the amount or efficiency of the labor he has contributed. Thus, the system of ownership, which at present, in 1931, actually exists or is supposed by law to exist in Soviet Russia, seems to oscillate between communism and collectivism as here defined. Hence, collectivism may broadly be described as universal co-partnership established compulsorily and by law as the prevailing system of ownership over the whole state. Private ownership, in opposition to the communal system of ownership, is that of private ownership. In this, the individual or family has exclusive rights over such property as appertains to him in virtue of certain recognized titles, such as occupancy, production, inheritance, contract, etc. And ordinarily, each individual or family depends for sustenance solely or principally upon such goods. Unchristian concept of private ownership. We find this system in its extreme form in the old Roman Empire, before the rise of Christianity, and in modern states which have fallen under the influence of unchristian liberalism. And these social systems, communal ownership, though not illegal, did not and does not prevail to any considerable extent except in the public utilities, such as roads, public hospitals, the postal service, public libraries, etc., and in the religious or charitable institutions organized by the Church. The individual owner may control property to an unlimited extent. He may do what he likes with this property and live in the highest degree of luxury, without any reference to the needs of other members, even those of his own country or municipality. This perverted conception of ownership, resulting from a non-Christian attitude of mind and belonging properly to an unchristian civilization, was first introduced into the Christian states of Europe in the 14th and 15th centuries with the introduction of Roman law. It was, however, only after the rise of Protestantism in the 16th century that it gained general currency. The most repulsive feature of this extreme system of private ownership is that many individuals, sometimes even the majority of the population, may be practically excluded from their natural right of access to the goods of the earth. This exclusion may be enforced by law as in the case of the slaves under the old Roman regime. Sometimes it arises as a result of the actual working of the system, as in the case of the multitudes of the modern proletariat population. Medieval system of ownership. Medieval teaching rejected completely this extreme form of private ownership, emphasizing the limitations which the natural law as well as Christian teaching set to property rights, while not repudiating or even discouraging communal ownership where found practical and useful as a supplementary and corrective element within the prevailing system of private ownership. Medieval teaching and practice rejected communal ownership as the ordinary system of conducting human affairs. The medieval doctors maintained that the only system compatible at the same time with man's temperament and with the teachings of Christianity was a system of private ownership limited by obligations of justice and charity, subject in due measure to the higher dominion, altum dominium, of the state, and supplemented, where useful and possible, by a certain admixture of communal ownership. St. Thomas's teaching. The Christian and medieval teaching on ownership may be gathered from several passages in the Summa and other writings of St. Thomas. His doctrine, which is founded upon the gospel teaching as interpreted by the early fathers, summarizes the recurrent views of his time, and was adopted as the standard by all or practically all the medieval writers. He has been followed also by the great Catholic theologians of the 16th and 17th centuries. We may briefly summarize St. Thomas's doctrine as follows. Number 1. God, who alone has the supreme dominion and ownership of material things, has ordained the latter for the use of all. Hence, such a practical access to these things as may enable man to supply his human needs is natural to him, and is each man's inalienable right. Number 2. It is false, and even heretical, to say that all private or exclusive ownership of material things is against the natural law. Number 3. The system of private, as contrasted with that of communal ownership, is not only lawful, but within certain limits is necessary for the due conduct of human life, at least as long as men retain their present normal characteristics. Hence it is imposed on man by the law of nations, jus gentium. proofs of the necessity of private ownership. This last proposition St. Thomas proves by 3 reasons. A. Private ownership supplies a necessary stimulus to human endeavor, for men will not ordinarily put forth their best efforts in productive labor, except the fruits of the labor are to be their own. B. Private ownership facilitates the proper division and coordination of labor, whereas in communal ownership the distribution of labor would be very difficult or impossible. C. Private ownership promotes peace and harmony, for in this system, when properly understood, each one has sufficient and is content with his own, whereas disputes occur more frequently among those that possess things in common. Christian concept of private ownership. The system of private ownership, however, which St. Thomas defends as lawful and in practice obligatory, is not to be understood in the extreme individualistic sense already referred to. It includes only exclusive right of dominion and the control of the production or exploitation and of the distribution of the goods. Potestas procurandi et dispensandi. It does not include the exclusive right to the use of them. This right is strictly limited and cannot be exercised without due consideration for the needs of others. In this regard, the owner has only a priority or first claim as far as his needs require. St. Thomas's words are as follows. In regard to that, namely the use of goods, one must not regard material things as one's own, but as common property, so that one freely shares them with others who need them. The limitation here implied to the lawful use of property rights is an obvious conclusion from the fundamental principle that God has ordained material things to satisfy the needs of all. The actual division of them by means of private ownership, which is a human institution, cannot validly contravene that decree, nor therefore prevent men from satisfying their needs by them. Consequently, the property which people possess in excess of what they require should be used to satisfy the needs of those who are in want. Its social aspects. Hence, according to medieval teaching, the rights of private ownership were subject to the following limitations. A. Anyone may, in case of a clear and pressing need, evidens et urgens necessitas, lawfully disregard another's ownership and appropriate for his own use what he thus clearly and urgently requires. Nor can the owner, who has no urgent and immediate need of the thing in question, lawfully prevent him. He would violate charity and even justice by doing so. B. The owner is bound at least under an obligation of charity to distribute the goods he does not require for his own reasonable needs to those that do need them. Hence, his exclusive right to such goods is confined to the control over the working or exploitation of the capital, and directing the distribution of the proceeds. Potestas procurandi et dispensandi. These latter he is bound, in varying degrees and within varying limitations, according to circumstances, to give to those in need. But when all men's wants cannot be relieved, the owner may select the particular persons with whom he will share the goods. C. Although outside the case of clear and pressing needs, an individual may not lawfully appropriate for his own use even the superfluous goods of his neighbor. He has a right in legal justice that the public authority, whether guild or municipality or state, should see to it that he gets a fair opportunity of providing for all his reasonable needs, even though it were necessary for that purpose to override another's ownership in regard, that is, to his superfluous goods. Extension of communal side-by-side with private ownership. The tendency of medieval teaching and practice was to encourage a reasonable and voluntary extension of the communal ownership of property, as an offset to the dangers and shortcomings of an exclusive system of private ownership. For the Church has always recognized that private property alone is not sufficient to meet the needs of the masses of the people. There will always be numbers who cannot, or in practice will not, acquire private property sufficient for their security. Hence, some type of communal or quasi-communal property is usually required to supplement private ownership. Owing to this attitude on the part of the Church, it gradually came about in nearly every country of Europe as a result of the voluntary gifts of Christian rulers and other pious benefactors, that a large portion of the wealth, including sometimes almost a third of the whole property of the country, was held in trust by Christian corporations, of various kinds to be administered for the benefit of the members, and others in accordance with their actual requirements. Thus, church property and the corporate property of the guilds were applied and distributed, to a great extent in meeting the wants of those in need, especially in land. There were besides, in every country, large tracts of land called commons, which were held on the communal system. Again, turbary rights, fishing rights, hunting rights, etc., were also usually communal. It was in accordance with the general custom in medieval times, if not a recognized principle, that all the soil should not be appropriated, and even in what was appropriated, that certain rights should always be reserved to the community. Conclusion. All these customs and recognized principles, limiting property rights and supplementing the system of private ownership, combined with the influence upon public opinion of the Church's teaching, had an immense effect during all this period in equalizing the condition of the people and moderating extremes of poverty and wealth. Article 2. The Just Price. Application in medieval times. The medieval law of just price is another example of the altruistic spirit which permeated the social and economic life of the Middle Ages. Individuals were not permitted to use freely the property they controlled in ways that might be detrimental to the common good. They were compelled, when the needs of others required it, to place the goods they had to dispose of at the service of the public under equitable conditions. The poor and weak were protected against unfair competition, so that all might be secured a fair access to the material goods of the community. The laws of just price had to be observed in wages, buying and selling, and every contract of exchange. Otherwise the contract was accounted unjust and invalid in conscience, and the aggrieved party had a claim to restitution. Whoever, writes Trithemius, a well-known 15th-century author, buys up corn, meat, and wine in order to drive up their prices and amass money at the cost of others, is, according to the laws of the Church, no better than a common criminal. In a well-governed community, all arbitrary raising of prices in the case of articles of food and clothing is peremptorily stopped. In times of scarcity, merchants who have supplies of such commodities can be compelled to sell them at fair prices. For in every community, care should be taken that all the members should be provided for, lest a small number be allowed to grow rich and revel in luxury to the hurt and prejudice of the many. Contrasts between Christian and non-Christian standpoint. In the old Roman law, just as in modern liberal states, selfishness was assumed to be the dominating motive in every contract, and the fullest liberty was allowed to both parties to decide the price and even to overreach each other, provided nothing was done that the law regarded as fraud. According to medieval teaching, on the other hand, the price of a commodity was supposed to be determined by objective value alone, and could not be justly influenced by the special need or ignorance of the buyer or the seller. Doctrine of the just price. This doctrine, which was universally accepted in medieval times, is thus summarized by St. Thomas. If the price exceeds the value of the thing, or if the thing is worth more than the price paid, the equality which justice requires is done away with. The seller cannot justly exact a higher price merely on account of the special need the buyer may have of the thing, or the accidental advantage that may accrue to him from it, or in such cases he would be selling what is not his. Hence the criterion of exchange value was something intrinsic to the commodity itself, not merely a competition or the higgling of the market. Hence, too, the modern distinction between value in use and value in exchange, was recognized only to a very limited extent. How it was fixed. The objective value of a commodity was calculated mainly and primarily upon the cost of production. This latter, which was accounted the first charge upon every product, was itself determined on the basis of a becoming standard of living for the producers. In the case of most commodities, the just price was usually fixed by the guilds or by the municipality, or even by the state. Even when the price was not legally determined, it was not left to the arbitrary decision of the buyer or seller, but was supposed to be fixed by what was known as the common estimation of the community. In this case, although prices might vary within certain limits, it was well understood that to pass these limits for accidental causes, such as scarcity or the special needs of the buyer or seller, would be unjust. Medieval attitude towards trade and speculation. Medieval principles ordinarily approve only of two sources of wealth and profit, namely, the natural produce of the earth and labor. The occupation of the speculator or trader, he, namely, who buys not in order to use but to sell again at a dear price, was looked upon with disfavor, and its morality was, for a long time, considered doubtful. Such trading, says St. Thomas, is justly condemned. Because of its own nature, it subserves the desire of gain which knows no limit and tends to indefinite increase. He goes on, however, to say that it is not necessarily vicious, and that moderate profits, which would be a just wage for one's labor, would be lawful. Although the prevailing attitude towards trading became more liberal in the following centuries, with the gradual expansion of commerce consequent upon the Crusades, it was always held to be less honorable in itself than productive labor, and of less solid utility to the state. Besides, it was recognized that the activities of the trader and the commercial dealer, owing to the numerous temptations to avarice and dishonesty, and the greater difficulty in ensuring the observance of the law of just price, required to be carefully scrutinized and kept within the limits of justice. The recompense of labor, or the rate of wages, was determined in accordance with the general rules relating to just price. Labor is the ordinary means by which, according to the law of nature, man supplies the needs of human life. Hence it was regarded as possessed of an intrinsic minimum value. This value was calculated on the principle that the worker should have wherewithal to support life and reasonable human conditions, according to his capacity and state. The price of the labor expended in the production of an article, or the worker's wage, was regarded as the first consideration in fixing the price of a commodity. The actual rate of wages was usually fixed by the guilds. Recognized, but not elaborated by medieval writers. The obligation of paying a just wage was so universally accepted that the matter is little discussed by the medieval writers. St. Thomas refers to the just wage only accidentally here and there. Albertus Magnus alludes to the same matter in his Ethica, where he implies that the human needs of the producer of the article, or in other words, the amount of the labor expended on its production, is the main element to be considered in estimating its exchange value. But that question was not then by any means as urgent or important as it has become in our times. In those days, the proletariat, or class of unpropertied wage earners, did not exist, or was very small. The peasant or serf had his own holding, the labor he had to give to the lord of the soil being regulated by custom, while the working classes of the towns were mostly independent producers who sold their wares instead of their labor. Article 3. Usury. Prevalence and destructive effects of usury. Leo XIII, enumerating the main causes of the misery and wretchedness of which the working classes of modern times are the unhappy victims, mentions usury as one. Public institutions and laws have set aside the ancient religion. Hence, by degrees, it has come to pass that the working men have been surrendered, isolated, and helpless to the hard-heartedness of employers and the greed of unchecked competition. The mischief has been increased by rapacious usury, which, although more than once condemned by the Church, is nevertheless under a different guise, but with like injustice still practiced by covetous and grasping men. Divas speaks of the prevalence of usury and the incalculable misery it has caused, from remote ages to the present day, as among the saddest features of history, and adds truly that the prevention and punishment of this crime are among the first duties of government. He quotes from the official report on money lending issued by the British government in June 1898, instances of money being lent in England at an interest of anything between 60% and 3,000%. The law, he continues, became a partner to outrageous injustice, for except in the rare cases where illegal fraud could be proved, it inflicted no punishment on the usurers. But in many countries, besides our own, the slackness or absence of usury laws gave such an impetus to similar misdeeds and ruined so many peasants in Europe and India and Ireland, that the 19th century has been called the century of usury. It is generally recognized that the rapacious usury of which Leo XIII speaks has been, and still is, both in its naked form and under a different guise, one of the radical causes of social misery in Ireland and elsewhere. Thus, amid universal business depression, unemployment, and poverty, the moneyed interests are allowed to control the distribution, and in a large measure the production, even of the necessaries of life, making enormous profits to the injury or ruin of both producers and consumers. Medieval attitude on usury. Such widespread abuse would not be possible in the medieval times. Public opinion, formed under the guidance of the Church's teaching, justly regarded usurers and unjust profiteers as the very worst of criminals. Dante, voicing the sentiments of his age, puts the usurers in the lowest division of his seventh circle in hell, in company with the most degraded and unnatural sinners. And thence the inmost round marks with its seal Sodom and Cahors, and all such as speak contemptuously of the Godhead in their hearts. Christian teaching, as we have already seen, emphasizes the dignity of manual toil and the duty of labor for all. It condemns idleness as unnatural and degrading, and is opposed to the divine ordinance that men should employ their God-given energies to suitable labor. This doctrine, which was then accepted as a fundamental principle of social life, would alone be sufficient to render the calling of the usurer dishonorable. The practice was besides definitely condemned on other grounds. The early fathers protest against usury in the strongest terms, and the Church always regarded it with disfavor. It had been forbidden to clerics since the 4th century, and to lay people as well as clerics since the 9th. This prohibition was again and again enforced in the 12th century. Of the numerous ecclesiastical decrees on the subject, we may mention those of 2 German councils of Lateran, 1139 and 1179, in which the penalty of excommunication with denial of Christian burial was decreed against usurers, and that of Gregory X, a century later, who ordained in the Council of Lyons, 1274, that no community, corporation, or individual should permit foreign usurers to hire houses, but should expel them from their territories. Church's discipline at present day. We may note that, although the Church's prohibition of usury has been confirmed again and again in modern times, especially by Benedict XIV and the encyclical Vix Penevit, 1745, there has been a certain relaxation of the law since the early years of the 19th century. This apparently modified attitude of the Church is confirmed in the recently issued Code of Canon Law, which, in dealing with the matter, reads as follows. If a commodity which is consumed by its first use, such as money, bread, etc., be lent on the stipulation that it becomes the property of the borrower, who is bound to return to the lender, not the thing itself but its equivalent only, the lender may not receive any payment by reason of the loan itself. In the giving or lending of such a commodity, however, it is not in itself unlawful to make an arrangement for the recovery of interest at the rate allowed by the civil law, de lucro legali Pacifici, unless that rate is clearly excessive. One may even arrange for a still higher rate of interest, if there be a just title for doing so, in proportion to the amount of the excess. According to the terms of this canon, one may, without enquiry or solicitude as to the existence or not the extrinsic titles, such as accidental loss caused by the loan, the risk of not being repaid, etc., receive interest at the rate laid down by the civil law, provided that rate be not clearly excessive. The reason for this change or apparent change in the Church's attitude towards usury is that in modern times, owing to the capitalistic organization of economic life, money has practically become a form of capital, and the Church follows her traditional policy in regulating her attitude towards it. As usual, she temporarily adjusts her discipline as far as possible to the needs of the age, even when these needs are the result of a state of things of which she does not approve, and allows the faithful to act in accordance with social customs sanctioned by existing civil law, provided these customs are not manifestly immoral or unjust. Hence, in the present instance, she allows the faithful to avail within certain limits of the civil law and custom regarding usury and interest. We have already seen how, in a similar manner, owing to the needs of society and to avoid greater evils, the Church permitted masters in the early years of Christianity to retain their slaves, even though the institution of slavery is opposed to Christian principles. Catholic teaching on usury. Usury is, in a medieval sense, meant payment exacted for the use of borrowed money. The grounds for the Church's condemnation of usury as essentially unjust are expounded by St. Thomas, whose teaching on the matter was universally adopted. Thus he writes, "Money, like wine and wheat, is consumed by being used. Hence the use of the thing cannot be separated from the thing itself. Consequently, he who, besides requiring back the thing, vis-a-vis the money lent, also exacts a price for its use, sells and gets paid for what does not exist, which is unjust." It may be objected to this argument that money, unlike bread or wine, may be used as capital, and that capital is, with labor, an element of production. Thus, a man who lends his machine or beast of burden to another in order that the latter may utilize it in productive labor, may lawfully require in payment a certain portion of the produce. In the same way, one who lends his money to another for capital or trading purposes may fairly exact a share in the profits. This objection refers only to money borrowed for capital, and would not in any case affect the question of money borrowed in order to procure goods of consumption, such as food or clothing. Even as regards the former kind of loan, St. Thomas does not admit the validity of the objection. His answer is, "The machine or beast lent to another still remains the property of the lender. Hence, the element it contributes toward the produce is his. In the case of money, it is different. When one borrows money, even for capital, the dominion or ownership of the money is transferred to the borrower. This is shown by the fact that the borrower may consume or destroy the money, which he does by using it. Besides, should the money get accidentally lost or mislaid while in the borrower's possession, the latter and not the lender is the sufferer. In the case of a borrowed instrument or animal, on the other hand, the borrower has no right to destroy the borrowed article, seeing he is not its owner. And should the article get lost or destroyed, when in his possession, through no fault of his, not he, but the lender, vis-a-vis the owner of the article, suffers the loss. Hence, the element which the borrowed money contributes to production belongs not to the lender, who no longer is the owner of money, but to the borrower, to whom the ownership has passed. Extraneous titles to interest on money lent. Although usury, that is, payment for the use of money, was unlawful, neither St. Thomas nor the other medieval writers deny that a certain modest payment may be exacted under other titles. If the lender suffered a positive loss by the loan, he might demand that the loss be recouped. If he himself would have utilized the money as capital had he retained possession of it, he might demand payment for the loss of opportunity he suffered by lending it. If, finally, his lending endangered in any way the security of whole or part of the amount, he may justly charge such an interest as may be considered equal to the risk incurred. The lender, however, who would exact payment for the use of money beyond the moderate interest that may come under these headings, was regarded as a usurer and fell under the penalties of the Church. Effects of the Church's prohibition. The Church's legislation and teaching did not, it is true, succeed in completely preventing the practice of usury, especially on the part of the Jews. These laws and principles were, however, an immense check upon the unjust activities of money-lenders and speculators, so that anything approaching the systemized extortion and stock gambling of modern times was impossible. Conclusion. It is commonly admitted that the undue concentration of wealth under the control of a few is one of the radical causes of social misery and unrest that prevail at the present day. Individuals controlling great wealth have excessive power in almost every phase of social activity, and, following the tendency of human nature, they too often use their power unjustly and tyrannically. Those huge fortunes are usually amassed by unjust profiteering, artificially created monopolies, usury, unjust reduction of wages, the sudden fluctuations of the markets which play into the hands of greedy speculators. The medieval economic doctrines and legislation and the public opinion they produced and fostered made impossible, or at least kept in check, such methods of accumulating wealth, and so were a potent safeguard against one of the worst types of social injustice.